Chicago, 6:45 in the morning. O'Hare International stretches for miles under a sky the color of old silver. Planes rise and fall in silence from this distance. Thousands of people moving through glass and fluorescent light, each carrying something, a bag, a deadline, a version of themselves to try to hold together before 8 a.m. One man walks through it all without hurrying. Gray at the temples, quiet hands, a paperback novel tucked under his arm like he is nowhere more important to be. He does. He just doesn't feel the need to announce it. Down the terminal, a woman in a pressed uniform straightens her badge and surveys her gait with the eyes of someone who has decided, long ago, exactly how much power she is allowed to take up. She sees him coming. Something shifts in her expression, and somewhere in that half second, in the space between one person's assumption and another person's silence, a decision is made, one that cannot be unmade.
The morning Edward Mercer got turned away from an airplane, he was thinking about coffee, not about the merger closing in Boston, not about the quarterly report Frank had sent at midnight, not about the fact that he was by most measures one of the wealthiest men in any room he walked into. He was thinking about bad airport coffee, the kind that tastes like someone boiled regret in a paper cup. That's how ordinary it started. That's how these things always start. O'Hare at 6:45 in the morning is its own kind of country. It has its own language, its own rules, its own particular species of misery, the rolling luggage, the half-eaten breakfast sandwich, the man in the gate seat who has already given up on the day before the sun finished rising. Edward moved through it the way he always moved through airports, quietly. No assistant jogging alongside him with a tablet, no driver waiting at the curb with a sign. He had a carry-on bag he packed himself, a boarding pass on his phone, and a paperback copy of James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, that he'd read so many times the spine had stopped fighting back. He liked airports when nobody knew who he was, which was most of the time. Because Edward Mercer didn't look like what people expected a billionaire to look like. He was 67 years old, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped silver hair and hands that still looked like they'd done actual work at some point, which they had. For a very long time, he was wearing the hoodie his daughter gave him for his birthday, dark blue, no logo. Soft in the way that expensive things sometimes are soft quietly, without announcing it. He looked like somebody's grandfather headed home from a visit, which was fine by him. 3 months before this morning, Edward had signed the paperwork that made Mercer Capital a significant investor in Continental Holdings Group, the parent company of Meridian Air. Not a majority stake, not a controlling position, but enough to matter. Enough that Thomas Reeves, Meridian CEO, had personally called to welcome him. Enough that the financial press had run 3 different articles speculating about what it meant. Edward had read one of them, on the treadmill, then turned it off and finished his run. He didn't invest in airlines because he loved planes. He invested in systems, in the question underneath the question. Not is this airline profitable, but why isn't it more profitable? Not do passengers like it, but what happens when they don't? Which is why he was standing in the priority boarding line at gate G9 this morning. Not as Edward Mercer, investor, as a man with a ticket in coach shoes and a paperback novel, waiting to board like everyone else. Field research. Frank called it reckless. His daughter called it very Dad. His lawyer didn't know about it, and that was intentional. Before we get to gate G9, and we will get there, don't worry, there's something you need to understand about a woman named Patricia Hollis. Because Patricia Hollis did not wake up that morning planning to destroy her own life. People almost never do. She woke up at 5:15, same as always. Alarm off before the second buzz. Coffee on while she showered. Uniform pressed the night before, hanging on the door hook. 49 years old, 11 years with Meridian Air. 4 years as gate manager at O'Hare. She had a system, she had standards. She had a laminated schedule on her refrigerator, and a commute that took exactly 22 minutes unless the 94 was slow, which it sometimes was, and on those days she left 7 minutes earlier, because late was not something Patricia Hollis did. She arrived at O'Hare at 6:10, 45 minutes before her shift. She did this every day. Nobody asked her to, nobody noticed. But she did it because arriving early meant she was in control of the morning before the morning got any ideas. Her colleague, Carol Birch, was already at the desk when Patricia arrived. Carol was 53 and cheerful in a way that Patricia had long since stopped trusting. The kind of cheerful that meant nothing in particular. "Morning," Carol said. "Morning," Patricia said, and that was the extent of warmth they exchanged. Patricia Hollis was not a warm woman. She knew this, she'd made peace with it, or something that looked like peace from a distance. She straightened the documents on her desk, checked the day's passenger manifest, checked the gate schedule, checked the weather for Boston, their first departure at 7:40. Everything in order, everything as it should be. Here is what nobody who worked with Patricia Hollis at Meridian Air knew. She used to be someone else. Not different in the obvious ways. Not younger or thinner or more innocent, though she was all of those things too. Different in the interior sense. In 2009, Patricia was 33 years old, and she worked ground service for a mid-size carrier out of Midway Airport. She loved it, which sounds naive but wasn't. She loved the moving parts of it, the logistics, the puzzle of it. Getting people where they needed to go, she was good at it. She was genuinely, notably good at it. And then on a Tuesday in March, a passenger in first class, a man in a suit she couldn't have afforded in 6 months of saving, decided she had handled his bag incorrectly. He didn't say this quietly. He said it in the middle of the check-in hall, at the top of his lungs, with language that made 3 other passengers look at their shoes. With a particular kind of contempt that is reserved for people who believe the distance between themselves and the person serving them is not just financial but fundamental. Patricia stood very still. She did not cry. She did not yell back. She stood still and took it because she had a mortgage and a son at home, and because the handbook said de-escalation first. Her supervisor was standing 12 feet away. He watched the whole thing. Afterward, he walked over and said, "Some days are like that. Don't let it get to you." And that was the end of it. No reprimand for the passenger. No formal report. No acknowledgement that what had happened was wrong in any way that mattered. Don't let it get to you. Patricia didn't let it get to her. She did something quieter and more permanent. She learned the lesson that moment was actually teaching. Not the lesson she should have learned. The other one, if you want to not be hurt, be the one who decides who gets hurt. She's learned that lesson the way you learn a lesson when you have no one to tell you it's wrong. Completely. There was one other person at Gate G9 that morning who matters to this story. His name was Declan Burrows, 26 years old. 4th month on the job. Still at the stage where he arrived to work with something that hadn't quite become cynicism yet. Still at the stage where bad things surprised him. Which they were about to. Declan had grown up in Rockford, Illinois, with a mother who was a nurse and a father who drove long-haul trucks 3 weeks out of 4. He'd wanted to work in aviation since he was 7 years old, and his dad took him to the observation deck at O'Hare, and he watched a 747 rise off the runway like it was the most impossible and inevitable thing he'd ever seen. He was not naive. He'd been raised practical. But there are things you can't fully understand until you've stood in them. He was standing at the side desk reviewing the boarding sequence when the priority lane opened at 7:15. He noticed the older man in the blue hoodie immediately. Not because he was suspicious, because he was calm. Airports make most people anxious, the lines, the clocks, the feeling that something is always about to go wrong. But this man stood in the priority line with the particular stillness of someone who had been in enough difficult rooms to know that most of them eventually end. He was reading his book. Just reading his book. Patricia opened the priority lane herself. She stood at the podium with the practiced authority of someone who had decided, years ago, exactly how much space she was allowed to take up in any given situation, which was all of it. The first 3 passengers boarded without incident. Business travelers. Laptop bags. The particular tunnel vision of people who have already mentally arrived at their destination. Then Edward stepped up. He put the book in his bag, pulled out his phone with the boarding pass. Smiled the brief, polite, "I'm not going to be any trouble" smile that experienced travelers perfect over years of going through these motions. Patricia looked at his boarding pass, then at him, then at the boarding pass again. And something shifted in her expression. Subtle, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking. But Declan was looking because he was still learning to read the room, and what he saw made something cold settle in his stomach. Oh no, he thought. Don't, but he didn't say it out loud, because he was 26 years old and 4 months in, and Patricia Hollis ran that gate like it was sovereign territory. "Sir," she said, "I'm going to need your physical identification." Her tone was the same tone she used for everything. Controlled, official. Edward didn't hesitate. He reached into his carry-on, unzipped the front pocket, and produced his passport, unhurried, unbothered. Patricia took it. She opened it. Looked at his photo. Looked at his face. Looked at his photo again. This process took approximately 14 seconds longer than it needed to. This is already wrong, Declan thought. He didn't say that either. Mr. Patricia read from the passport. Mercer, that's right. Your boarding pass shows seat 1A. It does, first class. Yes, there was a pause that had no reason to exist. There seems to be a discrepancy, Patricia announced, loud enough for the people behind him to hear. Because that was intentional. Edward had heard those words before. Not at airports exactly, but in offices, in lobbies, in rooms where someone had decided, on the basis of what they could see, that he was in the wrong place. He'd been hearing variations of it since he was a young man in Detroit trying to get a bank loan for a business plan that 3 other men with less compelling numbers had gotten approved without a second look. He knew the feeling. He knew it the way you know an old injury in cold weather. Something in him registered it, filed it, kept his face exactly where it was. What kind of discrepancy? He asked. The system is flagging your seat assignment. I've flown this route 4 times this year. The booking went through without issue. I understand that, Patricia said in a tone that meant the opposite of understanding. However, our first-class cabin maintains certain standards regarding. She paused, just for a moment. Just passenger presentation. Silence. Not a long silence, 2 seconds, maybe 3. But the kind of 2 seconds that changes the temperature of a room. Oh, Declan thought. She just said that. Behind Edward, a woman in her mid-50s had gone very still. She was holding her boarding pass in one hand and a small notebook in the other, and she was no longer checking her phone. She was watching. Edward tilted his head slightly. Passenger presentation, he repeated. Yes. Can you show me where that policy is documented? I'm not obligated to provide documentation at the gate. You're not obligated, Edward agreed. But if you're going to cite a policy to deny someone their ticketed seat, it seems reasonable to be able to point to it, sir, Patricia said. And now the sir was doing a lot of work, none of it respectful. I'm going to ask you to step aside while we board the other passengers. I'd prefer not to. Your behavior is becoming disruptive. My behavior, Edward said carefully, is asking a question. Declan was gripping his clipboard so hard the plastic was warm. Say something, he told himself. Just say something. He knew there was no passenger presentation policy. He had read the employee handbook 3 times during training because that was the kind of person he was. He had taken notes, actual notes with a pen in a notebook. There was no such policy. But Patricia's certainty filled the space like weather, like something you couldn't argue with, and Declan was 26 years old with student loans and a mother recovering from a hip replacement, and the words stayed exactly where they were, in his head. Not helpful to anyone. He hated himself a little bit standing there, just a little. Patricia had a system. The system worked like this. Escalate the language. Introduce uncertainty. Make the person feel that they are the problem and that backing down is the reasonable thing to do. Most people back down. Most people have enough other things to worry about that they decide this particular hill isn't worth it. Most people. She had made an error in reading this particular person. She understood this approximately 45 seconds into the conversation, when Edward Mercer looked at her not with anger, not with the kind of loud, performative outrage she was equipped to handle, but with something worse. Recognition. He recognized what she was doing. She could see it, and he was going to stand there and be recognized until one of them had to actually deal with it. This one's going to be complicated, she thought, and instead of stopping, instead of reassessing, she doubled down. Because that's what you do when you've built a whole architecture of self-protection and someone starts poking at the foundation. In my professional judgment, Patricia said, her voice dropping to something that was supposed to sound decisive, you are not fit to board this flight. The words, right there, between them, unfit to board. Declan's clipboard actually slipped. He caught it, barely. Edward was quiet for a moment, not a stunned quiet, not a defeated quiet, the quiet of a man doing math. He thought about his phone call with Frank from last night, the Boston meeting, the signature he was supposed to put on a document that would close 12 months of work. He thought about Otis Grayburn, who was 81 years old and had once fixed his car for free 3 winters in a row because Edward was broke and it was January in Michigan, and Otis had said, "You'll be somebody someday. I'm not charging somebody someday." He thought about all of that. And then he looked at Patricia Hollis, not with anger, with the calm of a man who had been underestimated so many times that he had learned to treat it as information rather than injury. I've been turned away from things before, he said. His voice was quiet enough that only she could hear it. And Declan, who was approximately 4 feet away and no longer pretending to do anything else, not because I did anything wrong, because someone looked at me and made a decision based on what they saw. He paused. You're not the first person to do that. Patricia said nothing. But I want you to remember this, he said. This moment, Specifically, because I will. He stepped out of the line. He didn't slam anything, didn't raise his voice, didn't demand a manager or threaten a lawsuit or perform any of the things that would have given Patricia a comfortable story to tell later. He just stepped out of the line, picked up his carry-on, straightened his jacket, and walked away. The woman with the notebook watched him go. Her name was Eunice Caldwell, 71 years old, retired schoolteacher, visiting her granddaughter in Boston, which was why she was at Gate G9 on a Monday morning with a small rolling bag and the low-grade exhaustion of someone who'd been up since 4:30. She had been watching the whole exchange from her place in the regular boarding line. She had watched Patricia's face. She had watched Declan's hands. She had watched the passengers behind Edward find interesting things to look at in other directions. She had seen things like this before. Not exactly like this. The shape of it. The particular geometry of someone being told, without the words being used, you don't belong here. She opened her notebook, wrote something small, 4 lines, maybe 5, then closed it and put it back in her pocket. She didn't know why she wrote it down. She didn't know what she was going to do with it. Maybe nothing. But Eunice Caldwell had been a 7th-grade English teacher for 31 years, and the instinct to bear witness was older than anything else in her. Patricia boarded the rest of the flight without incident. Carol said, "That was a tough one." Patricia said, "I handled it." Carol said, "You always do." And Patricia felt briefly the small cold comfort of being agreed with by someone who would agree with anything. She typed up the incident report at her desk before the gate closed. She described Edward Mercer as agitated and non-compliant. She described herself as calm and professional in a difficult security assessment. She noted that the passenger had been escalating in tone and demeanor. She did not mention the dress code she had invented. She did not mention the 4 seconds of silence she had used like a weapon. She did not mention the way his face had looked when he finally stepped aside. She saved the report, logged off. Went to get her second coffee of the morning. She told herself, fine. In the Hilton O'Hare, room 412, not a suite, a standard room with a view of runway 10R. Edward Mercer sat on the edge of the bed. He had his phone in his hand. He was not, as one might expect, calling his lawyer. He was not calling his PR team or his assistant or anyone in the legal department at Mercer Capital. He was looking at a photograph. The one from his wallet, creased at the corner. Color slightly faded the way photos get when they've been carried around long enough. An old man in front of a garage, tool belt on his hip. A grin that was missing one tooth on the left side. From a hockey game in 1974 that Otis still described with more pride than the injury warranted. Otis Grayburn, 81 years old, Detroit. Edward had called him last Christmas. Otis had mentioned, casually, the way he mentioned everything, by the way. Flight last spring was something else. Don't like going to airports much anymore. Easier to just let Marcus drive me. Edward had asked what happened. Otis had said it was nothing, that he'd made a fuss about nothing, that he was being an old man about it. Edward had let it go. He was regretting that now. He put the photograph away. Then he called Frank. Frank, where are you? The gate agent said your name wasn't on the flight. Wasn't on the flight. Silence. Then what happened? I need you to pull a file. Edward's voice was even, not flat, not cold. Just the voice he used when he had already done all the deciding and now he was moving. Gate manager at O'Hare, Meridian Air, Gate G9. Name is Patricia Hollis. The name everything. Employment history, performance reviews, any complaint filed against her, internal, external, social media, letter to the airline, anything anyone ever put in writing. And not just Meridian, any airline she's ever worked for. Frank was quiet for exactly the amount of time it took him to understand the scope of what he was being asked. How fast? Morning, Edward. Morning, Frank. Another pause. Done. And the Boston meeting? I'll patch you in remote. Tell Halverson I was held up by a personnel matter. He doesn't need more than that. Okay then, you all right? Edward looked out the window at the runway. A 737 was turning at the end of the taxiway. Engines building to that specific pitch that means we are done with the ground now. I've been better, he said, but I've been a lot worse. He hung up. Meanwhile, Patricia Hollis drove home on the 94 at exactly the time she always drove home, with the radio on a station that played songs she didn't have to think about. She stopped at the grocery store, bought the usual things. At home, her husband Ray was in the kitchen, reheating something from the night before. He was 52, and he had the build of a man who'd spent 30 years doing physical work, and the expression of a man who'd spent 30 years coming home to someone who didn't want to talk about their day. They had an arrangement. Not a bad one, just a quiet one. Long day, he asked. Some difficult passengers, she said. She poured a glass of wine, not a lot. Just enough to mark the transition between the day and the evening. From the couch, a sound, the low volume of a TV, some kind of sport. That was Garrett, 23 years old, her son, living at home while he saved up, working nights at a distribution center. He was on his phone and the TV at the same time, which she'd given up commenting on somewhere around his 20th birthday. He didn't look up when she passed. She noticed that. She didn't think much about it. She went to her room, took off her uniform slowly, the way you take off something you need to be careful with, and hung it with the same precision she'd used that morning. She lay down on top of the covers. She told herself she felt fine. She slept deeply. No nightmares, no unease. The particular piece of someone who has not yet been introduced to the consequences waiting for them. Back at the Hilton, Edward did not sleep. Sat at the small desk with his laptop open. The Boston documents were in one tab. The Baldwin book was closed on the desk beside him. He looked at the phone. He thought about what he'd said at the gate. I've been turned away from things before. True. You're not the first person to do that. Also true. But I want you to remember this moment. And here was the thing about that. The thing he hadn't said out loud. Because you don't say everything out loud. You don't owe anyone access to the interior of you. But here it is anyway. He was tired. Not angry. Not bitter in the way that poisons things. Tired. Because he had been 67 years old for almost a year now. And before that he had been 66. And before that all the other numbers going back to the beginning. And at every single point along that line there had been someone willing to look at him and make a fast, comfortable decision about who he was and where he belonged. Every single point. He had built an empire. He had shaken hands with people who could move markets with a sentence. He had stood in rooms that most people didn't know existed and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. And he was still, sometimes, at 6:50 in the morning, a man who had to explain himself at the boarding gate. He closed the Boston tab, opened his email, began to draft a message to Frank with a list of the specific things he wanted from the Patricia Hollis file. Not revenge. He was clear on that with himself. Information. Because he had learned, over 40 years of doing this, that personal grievance was the least useful frame for any situation. What had happened to him that morning was not, first and foremost, about him. It was a system, a pattern, a series of choices that had been made over time and permitted by people who should have known better. You fix systems. You don't fix them by being angry. You fix them by understanding exactly how they work and then applying the correct pressure at the correct point. On the desk beside the laptop, the wallet, the photograph inside it, Otis, in front of the garage. By the way, flight last spring was something else. Edward closed his laptop, picked up his phone, not to call Frank again. He scrolled to a number he hadn't dialed in a few months. More than a few months, if he was honest. Otis's son. Marcus answered on the third ring. Slightly surprised, they talked for a few minutes about nothing, the garage, the winter. Marcus's youngest starting school. Then Edward said, "How's your father?" A brief pause. "He's good. You know Otis, complaining about his knees but still out there giving people advice they didn't ask for." Edward smiled. "First time all morning. Can I come by?" he said. "Not soon." "But soon." "Of course," Marcus said. "He'd love that." After he hung up, Edward sat for a moment with the quiet that specific kind of decision makes. Not the Boston decision, not the Patricia Hollis decision, the Otis decision. The one that had nothing to do with power or leverage or consequence. Just an old man who told him he'd be somebody someday. And a promise, silent and long overdue, to show up. Outside, a plane lifted off runway 10R. The sound reached the hotel window as a low, diminishing roar. Edward watched the lights until they disappeared into the cloud cover. Then he turned back to his desk and went back to work. Declan Burrows drove home that night on the Blue Line. Standing room only, holding the overhead bar and staring at nothing in particular. He replayed the morning, specifically the moment. Words not fit to board. Specifically himself, standing 4 feet away, saying nothing. He tried the story where he'd had no choice, where speaking up would have cost him his job, where Patricia's authority over that gate was total and unchallengeable, and what could he possibly have said? He tried that story, it didn't fit. At home, his wife Nora was making dinner. She was an air nurse and she had worked a 10-hour shift, and she was still somehow the one making dinner, which was one of many reasons Declan was aware he had married someone out of his league. "Bad day?" she said, not looking up. "Weird day." He sat down at the kitchen counter, told her what happened. Not the whole context. Just, a woman at work had been unfair to a passenger, and he had stood there and done nothing. Nora was quiet for a moment, then. "Was it a stranger?" Yeah, so no personal risk if you'd said something. I mean, she's my supervisor, Declan. Nora set down the spoon. If that was your dad in that line, what would you have done? He opened his mouth, closed it. She picked the spoon back up. He sat there for a while with that question in his chest, which is where it would stay all night, which is where it would stay until the next morning when he would sit down, open his email, and write what he should have said out loud. The morning Edward Mercer got turned away from an airplane, he was thinking about coffee. But by the time night fell on that Monday in October, he was thinking about something else. About a garage in Detroit. About a photograph in a wallet. About the weight of having enough power to do something about it. And about whether he'd been carrying that weight responsibly. The answer, he suspected, was complicated. The answer, he decided, was going to require a pen, and a piece of paper, and a very long conversation with Frank Aldridge, starting at 7 in the morning. Frank Aldridge had been doing this for 30 years. 30 years of early mornings and late calls and conversations that started with Edward's voice being too calm and ended with Frank needing antacids. He knew the signs. So when Edward called at 7:03 on Tuesday morning and said, "What did you find?" before Frank had even finished saying hello, Frank already had the file open on his desk, because he'd been up since 5. Because he knew. The file on Patricia Hollis was supposed to be routine, a background pull, a complaint history. The kind of thing that takes a few hours and comes back with a handful of minor incidents and some noise on social media. Routine. Except it wasn't. Frank had worked with the private investigation firm. Mercer Capital kept on retainer for exactly this kind of due diligence. Sharp people. Discreet. Good at finding the things that exist in the gap between what's officially documented and what actually happened. They delivered the file at 6:47 in the morning. 14 pages. Frank read it once fast, then again slow. Then he sat very still for approximately 4 minutes doing nothing at all, which was unusual for him, because Frank Aldridge was not a man who sat still. Then he called Edward. "How thick?" Edward asked. 14 pages, Frank said. And that's just what they confirmed. There may be more. Silence on Edward's end. Not surprised silence. Something quieter than that. "Walk me through it." So Frank walked him through it. Patricia Hollis, gate manager, O'Hare, Meridian Air. 4 years in the role. Prior to that, 8 years in various ground operations positions. Prior to that, a stint at a regional carrier out of Midway that ended. Frank noted this without formal documentation of why. On paper, her record was adequate, which was the first problem, because adequate doesn't generate 14 pages. The complaint started in 2021. Not a flood, a trickle, but a trickle with a pattern. A man in a turban, traveling from Chicago to Seattle for his daughter's wedding, pulled aside at the gate despite having TSA pre-check. Patricia had cited his carry-on as oversized. It was not oversized. The gate agent who measured it, not Declan. Someone before Declan confirmed it was within regulation. The man missed his flight, filed a complaint, received a form letter and a $50 travel credit. $50 for missing his daughter's wedding. Frank read that part out loud and then stopped talking for a moment. "Keep going," Edward said. A family mother, father, 2 kids, traveling from O'Hare to Miami who spoke limited English. Patricia had accused them of attempting to bypass baggage fees by misrepresenting the contents of their bags. There was no evidence of this. The family was held at the gate for 40 minutes while other passengers boarded. They made the flight by 4 minutes. The mother had been crying. A fellow passenger documented this on her phone and posted it, but the post didn't get traction and the complaint went nowhere. A young woman, early 20s. Traveling with a cello, a vintage instrument, insured, properly documented as a paid carry-on. Patricia had declared it a gate hazard. The young woman had protested. Patricia had prevailed. The cello was gate-checked. It came off the carousel with a crack in the body that cost more to repair than the young woman made in 2 months. The repair estimate was in the file. Frank read the number. Edward didn't say anything. "There are 7 confirmed cases," Frank said. 7 that have documentation. There are references in online forums, airline complaint boards, a couple of travel subreddits to incidents that match the pattern without names attached. Could be more. Probably are. "What's the pattern?" Edward asked. Frank knew he didn't need to answer this, but he answered it anyway. "People she perceived as not belonging," he said. "Not a single category, not one demographic. People who were confident. People who looked like they were in the right place. People who didn't fit whatever template she was using for what a first-class passenger or a priority boarding passenger was supposed to look like." A long pause. "And the airline?" Each complaint was handled individually. Vouchers, form letters, One supervisor note flagging that Patricia had received multiple complaints in a 12-month period, but the note was marked resolved. No follow-up action. By who? Frank found the name in the file. Howard Fitch, Regional Operations Director. O'Hare. Still there? Still there. Edward was quiet for almost 10 full seconds. Frank had learned over 30 years what the different silences meant. There was the silence that meant Edward was angry and choosing not to show it. There was the silence that meant Edward was surprised, which was rare. There was the silence that meant Edward had already decided and was letting the decision settle before he spoke it into existence. This was the third one. "Get me Thomas Reeves," Edward said. Thomas Reeves, CEO, Meridian Air. A man who had sent Edward a very gracious handwritten note when Mercer Capital completed its investment. A man who had described his airline as committed to excellence in every customer interaction. "Tonight?" Frank asked. "Now." Frank pulled up Reeves's number, and Frank, "Yeah, read me the last name on page 11. The one you skipped over." A pause. Frank found page 11. He'd skipped it because he wasn't sure how to say it. Wasn't sure what it meant for the conversation they were about to have. He read the name. Silence. "Otis," Edward said. Not a question. Here is what Frank didn't know. Because Edward hadn't told him. Because Edward didn't tell many people. Otis Grayburn had fixed Edward's car 3 winters in a row. 1,989. 1,990, 1,991. A succession of Detroit winters and a succession of cars that had no business running in them but kept running because Otis made them run. Edward had been 29, 30, 31. Mercer Capital was not yet a name, it was an idea, a business plan in a binder, a series of meetings with people who said interesting in a way that meant no. He had very little money and very much ambition, and Detroit in January did not care about either. Otis Grayburn ran a garage on Livernois Avenue. He was 45 years old at the time. He had a missing tooth from a hockey game he still talked about. He had a daughter in nursing school and a son who was learning the business and a philosophy about people that he delivered in very short sentences while looking at engines. "Most people are worth more than they're being paid for," he said once. "Doesn't mean they know it yet." He never charged Edward. Not once in 3 winters. When Edward tried to pay, Otis would find something technically wrong with the invoice and rework the math until it came out to 0. "You'll be somebody someday," he'd said. "The last winter. I'm not charging somebody someday." Mercer Capital had been founded 14 months later. What page 11 of the file said. August 2024. A passenger traveling from O'Hare to Detroit Metro. 81 years old. Traveling alone. Patricia Hollis had pulled him aside at the gate. Said she had concerns about an undeclared item in his carry-on. Asked him to open the bag. There was no undeclared item. There was nothing in that bag that wasn't exactly what it appeared to be. The clothes of an old man visiting his daughter. A paperback mystery novel. A bag of hard candy he always kept on him. The kind his wife had liked, even though his wife had been gone for 6 years. He opened the bag. In front of whoever was standing nearby. Standing still the way you stand still when you don't know what you've done wrong, but everyone is looking at you like you must have done something. Nothing was found. Patricia Hollis logged the incident as a routine security check. Otis Grayburn did not file a complaint. He told his son it was nothing, that he'd made a fuss about nothing, that he was being an old man about it. He didn't fly again after that. When his granddaughter's graduation was in April, he told everyone he wasn't feeling well. He took a 9-hour bus ride instead. 9 hours. Because an airport had been turned into a place where he'd been made to feel like a criminal for no reason, by a woman who didn't know him and hadn't tried to. Edward hung up with Frank, sat in the hotel room for a while. Just sat. Outside the window, planes were taking off and landing with the indifferent efficiency of a system that did not concern itself with what happened to the people inside it. Picked up his phone. Didn't call Frank back. Didn't call the lawyers. Called Marcus, Otis's son. Asked him, "Your father?" This time he listened differently. "He's good," Marcus said, "you know. He doesn't complain." "Yeah," Edward thought, "I know. That's the problem." Frank reached Thomas Reeves at 9:15 in the morning. Reeves was in his Atlanta office mid-preparation for a board call that was now not happening. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Frank described it to Edward afterward as the sound a man makes when he realizes the thing he didn't know could also be the thing that ends him. Thomas Reeves had been CEO of Meridian Air for 6 years. He was 58, he was thorough and ambitious, and by most accounts, competent. He had shepherded the airline through 2 difficult fiscal years and a merger that could have gone badly and didn't. He was not, Frank believed, a bad man. He was a man who had built systems of accountability that looked good in annual reports and worked beautifully for problems that announced themselves clearly. What he had not built was a system that caught the slow, quiet, unreported damage done by people like Patricia Hollis to people like Otis Grayburn, which was, Frank told him, the actual problem. "Tell me you have the security footage," Reeves said. "We have the footage," Frank said. "The audio? Completely clear." The sound Reeves made at that point was not a word exactly. "Mr. Mercer's expectation," Frank said, "is not a phone call. He wants to understand what happened. He wants to understand why it was allowed to happen. And he wants to understand what Meridian Air intends to do about both questions." A long silence from Atlanta. "When can I fly to Chicago?" Patricia Hollis did not know any of this was happening. On Tuesday she had a regular shift, ran 3 gates, had one minor boarding delay due to a gate change that she handled without issue, had lunch at her desk, completed her administrative reports, talked to Carol for 12 minutes about a reality show they both watched. A completely ordinary day. On Wednesday, also ordinary. She had begun to think of the Monday incident as closed, filed, done. The passenger had walked away. She had documented it. That was that. She did not think about his face. She did not think about what he'd said to her. Not consciously. But that night, Wednesday night, she found herself standing in front of the bathroom mirror for longer than usual. Just standing there. Looking at herself in the uniform she hadn't yet taken off. She didn't know why. She told herself it was nothing. She went to bed. Thursday morning. Patricia arrived at 6:10 as always. Carol was at the desk as always. Morning. And then Paul, her supervisor, a harried man who wore his stress around his eyes, appeared from the back corridor and said, "Patricia, can I see you? I'm setting up for the 7:15. Now if you don't mind." She minded, but she went. Paul's office was small and smelled like the particular anxiety of a man who had received a phone call he didn't want to receive. He sat down behind his desk. Didn't offer her a seat. She sat anyway. "What's this about?" He was looking at something on his computer screen, not looking at her. "There's been a complaint," he said, "about the Monday incident. I filed a full report on that." "I know. The passenger was non-compliant. I documented Patricia." He finally looked at her. "Thomas Reeves is flying in from Atlanta this morning." The name landed in the room and changed the temperature. Thomas Reeves, the CEO, from Atlanta, for a boarding complaint. Something moved in Patricia's chest, fast and cold, like a door swinging open somewhere that she'd thought was locked. "Why?" she said. Not a question, the word just appeared. "I don't have all the details yet," Paul said, "but they've requested you be available at 10, conference room B." He looked at his screen again. She understood she was not being asked. She went back to her gate, ran the 7:15. Did her job with the precision she always brought to her job. But a part of her brain was doing something else entirely. Thomas Reeves, from Atlanta, for a boarding complaint. There was a voice in the back of her head, small, cold, getting louder, that was trying to tell her something. She kept overriding it. It was a routine situation, she told herself. I handled it correctly. He was agitated, she told herself. I had grounds. I've handled dozens of situations like this, she told herself. This one is no different. Except the CEO of the airline was flying in from Atlanta for this one. People like Thomas Reeves didn't fly from Atlanta for routine situations. Okay, the voice said, so maybe not so routine. She straightened her posture. She checked the boarding sequence for the 8 o'clock. She did not let herself think about the man in the blue hoodie. She did not let herself think about his face when he'd said, I want you to remember this moment. She did not. Conference room B, 10 o'clock. Patricia walked in with the posture she'd been perfecting for 11 years. Back straight, chin up. The posture that said, I am a professional, I am in control. I belong in every room I walk into. And stopped. Thomas Reeves was at the head of the table. She'd seen his photograph, the employee newsletter, the annual report. He looked like his photographs, lean, gray at the temples, the kind of composed that gets composed over decades. Beside him, a woman she didn't recognize, dark suit, notepad, legal. Beside her, a man in his 50s she recognized as the regional HR director. She'd met him once at a training day 2 years ago. And at the far end of the table, Howard Fitch, her regional operations director, the man who had on multiple occasions over the past 4 years told her she was doing a good job. Howard Fitch was not looking at her. Howard Fitch was looking at the table. Okay, the voice said. That's not good. She sat down. Reeves didn't waste time. Miss Hollis, he said. Thank you for being here. I want to go through what occurred on Monday morning at Gate G9. I filed a complete report. We have your report. His voice was level. We also have this. He nodded to the woman beside him. She pressed something on the laptop in front of her. The screen at the end of the room came on, security footage. Gate G9, Monday morning, 7:15. Patricia watched herself on screen. And the thing about watching yourself on a security camera with clean audio, really clean audio, the kind that picks up not just words but the precise texture of how those words were said, is that it removes the story you've been telling. It removes the framing, it just shows you what happened. She watched herself look at Edward Mercer. She watched that half second too long. She watched herself invent a policy that did not exist. She heard herself say, "Our first-class cabin maintains certain standards regarding passenger presentation." She heard herself say, "In my professional judgment, you are not fit to board this flight." The room was absolutely silent. The video ended. Nobody spoke. Then Reeves said quietly, "Can you show me the documentation for the passenger presentation policy?" Tricia said nothing. "Miss Hollis." There she stopped. "Say it carefully. The policy as I described it may not be formally." "There is no such policy," the HR director said. His voice wasn't unkind. It was almost worse. "It has never existed at Meridian Air. Not in any version of any employee handbook. Not in any training material. Not in any communication from corporate." She looked at Howard Fitch. He was still looking at the table. "Howard," she thought. "Howard, say something." Howard Fitch said nothing. Because Howard Fitch was also at this moment having a very bad morning. Because the HR director had earlier that day asked Howard some specific questions about a complaint filed weeks ago by a junior gate agent T at O'Hare, a complaint that had been flagged as received and marked resolved without any visible action taken. That complaint had been filed by Declan Burrows, and Howard had buried it, not maliciously. He'd told himself it was a junior employee still learning to read difficult passengers. He'd told himself Patricia was his best operator. He'd told himself the metrics spoke for themselves. He'd told himself a lot of things. None of them were holding up particularly well right now. Reeves placed a folder on the table. He slid it across to Patricia. "This is a summary of 7 formal complaints filed against you in the past 4 years, he said. 7 that we've confirmed. There may be additional cases that weren't formally reported." She opened the folder. The man in the turban, the family who spoke limited English, the young woman and the cello, 4 others. She read through them slowly, and the cold thing in her chest got colder, because she remembered some of them. Not all, she hadn't remembered all of them. They'd blurred together over the years. The incidents that hadn't felt like incidents, but some of them she remembered clearly. She remembered the cello. She remembered the woman crying. She remembered deciding that wasn't her problem. In each case, the HR director said, the complaint was closed with a travel credit and a form letter. In each case, your account of the incident was accepted without independent review. In each case, you described the passenger as the problem. He paused. "We now have security footage from 3 of these incidents. The footage does not support your accounts." The silence had weight now. Real weight. Patricia looked at Reeves. "I didn't know who he was," she said. "The Monday passenger. I didn't know." Reeves looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Hollis," he said, "that is the point. Let's leave that room for a moment. Let's go to a different room. 34 floors up in a building in Boston, where the closing documents for the Halverson deal were being signed. Edward was on screen, connected via secure video. His face was composed. His voice was focused. He negotiated with the same precision he always brought to rooms like this. And the people on the other side of the table had no way of knowing that the man they were watching had spent the previous 72 hours quietly dismantling something much closer to home. Because Edward Mercer was very good at compartmentalizing. He had learned this too in Detroit, in those early years. When you are building something out of nothing, you learn to hold multiple things at once without letting them crash into each other. You learn to be fully present in the room you're in, even when part of your mind is somewhere else entirely. The Halverson deal closed at 11:42. Frank sent him a message, "Reeves meeting done. Call me." Edward excused himself from the screen. "How did she take it?" Edward asked. "Hard to say," Frank said. "She's not someone who shows a lot. But when they showed her the footage, a pause. She went quiet." "What does Reeves want to do?" "He's terminating her, effective immediately. And he's opening an investigation into Fitch." Fitch buried the Burrows complaint. "That's confirmed. 8 months ago, Declan filed internally about her behavior. Fitch marked it resolved. No investigation, no follow-up, nothing." Edward sat with that. "The kid spoke up," he said, "and got nowhere. Until he submitted a voluntary statement to the investigation team on Tuesday morning. Full account of what he witnessed Monday. He didn't know who you were when he submitted it. He submitted it. Because it was the right thing to do," Edward said. "Yeah, quiet, Frank. Yeah. I want to talk about what happens next." What happens next was three things. Edward laid them out for Frank and then, in a separate call, for Thomas Reeves. Not optional, not suggestions, conditions. The first, an independent review board to examine all complaints filed against Meridian Air Gate personnel at O'Hare in the past 5 years. Not just Patricia's, all of them. Because this was not a single-person problem and Edward was not going to pretend it was. The second, personal letters. Written by Reeves, specifically by Reeves, not by legal, not by the communications department. Letters to each confirmed victim, with a real acknowledgement of what had happened and real compensation. Not $50 travel credits. Real compensation. The third, Declan Burrows, protected. Publicly, internally, unambiguously protected, and given a clear path forward that recognized what he'd actually demonstrated. Reeves listened to all three, then said, "What about you? Is there anything you—" "I'm one of 7, Edward said. "Probably more. I don't need anything from you." A pause, Mr. Mercer. Reeves said carefully. "I want you to know—" "I know," Edward said. "I can hear that you mean it. That matters. But what matters more is what happens after this phone call. I'll be watching." He ended the call. There is a document, a single page. Edward's legal team prepared it. Reeves's legal team reviewed it. It was the formal acknowledgement, investor to Airline, that the internal investigation had been conducted properly, and that the remedial measures outlined were being implemented. Edward's signature was the last line. He was in his office now, back in Chicago. The window behind him looked south toward the lake, which was gray and flat in the November light. Frank was sitting in the chair across the desk. The document was in front of Edward. The pen was in his hand. He didn't sign it, not yet. Frank watched him, didn't push. "She's 49, Edward said. "Yes. Mortgage. Probably. A kid, 23-year-old son. Lives at home." Edward put the pen down, looked out the window. "There's a woman in that file," he said slowly. "The cello. What happened to her?" Frank checked his notes. The repair cost was reimbursed by the airline's insurance after a formal claim process. 7 months after the incident. 7 months. Yes. Frank didn't have that information. "Find out," Edward said. A pause. "Okay," Frank said. "And the family, the one who spoke limited English. Find out where they were going and whether they made it." "To Miami. I know they made the flight. I want to know what they were going to. What they almost missed." Frank wrote it down. "Edward," he said gently. "Patricia Hollis made her choices. She made them over 4 years. She had ample opportunity to make different ones. I know that. The document is ready. Reeves is ready. This can be closed." Edward picked up the pen again, turned it over in his hand. Thought about Otis on the bus. 9 hours. Because the airport had become a place where he'd been made to feel like he'd done something wrong. Thought about the young woman with the cracked cello. Thought about the family running for a flight. Thought about Declan Burrows, 26 years old, writing an email on a Tuesday morning because his wife asked him the right question. He signed the document. But before he slid it across the desk, he picked up a pen, a different one, just a regular ballpoint from the cup on his desk, and wrote 3 lines at the bottom. Addendum. Frank read it, looked up. "This wasn't in the agreed terms," he said. "I know. Reeves will agree." "How do you know?" "Because if he doesn't, it means he doesn't actually understand what happened. And if he doesn't understand what happened, we have a much bigger problem." He paused. "He'll agree." Frank looked at the 3 lines again. The first, the independent review board to be chaired by an external ethics organization. Not internal. External. The second, Declan Burrows to be personally contacted by the CEO with a formal acknowledgement of his contribution to the investigation. The third, Otis Grayburn to receive a personal letter from Thomas Reeves, by name, acknowledging specifically what occurred in August 2024, with a handwritten apology, not typed, handwritten. Frank looked at Edward. "He's 81 years old," Edward said. "He took a 9-hour bus ride because someone made him feel like he'd done something wrong. He deserves a letter that someone actually touched." Patricia Hollis was escorted from the premises at 12:47 in the afternoon. A security officer, the HR director. Carol. Poor Carol, who had not been expecting this assignment and whose cheerfulness had completely failed her for the first time in living memory, watched from the doorway of the break room. Patricia carried a small box, the items from her desk, a travel mug, a photograph, a bottle of lotion, a laminated copy of the airport's operating schedule that she'd kept because she'd made notes in the margins over the years. She walked down the corridor, past the gate agents who suddenly needed to be looking at their screens, past Paul, who found something urgent in his paperwork, through the employees-only exit, into the parking structure, where she sat in her car for a very long time before starting the engine. She didn't cry. She wasn't ready to cry yet. Crying meant it was real. She was still in the part before that. The part where she was trying to find the version of this story where she was still right. She sat in the car, and sat, and sat. And then, finally, slowly, the version where she was still right stopped being available. And there was just the parking structure, and the fluorescent lights, and the box on the passenger seat, and the knowledge that she had walked into the airport this morning with 11 years of employment history, and walked out with a cardboard box and a security escort. She started the car, she drove home. Meanwhile, Declan Burrows was running a gate, not the same gate. Gate G11, different assignment. He didn't know yet what had happened in conference room B. Wouldn't know until his phone lit up with a message from HR later that afternoon asking him to come in for a conversation. He was just doing his job. A family was boarding 2 parents, 3 kids, one of whom had lost a shoe somewhere between security and the gate and had been found crying in front of the Hudson News. The shoe had been located. The family was 15 minutes late for boarding. Another gate agent would have closed the gate. Declan held it. 2 minutes, just 2 minutes, the family came through, breathless, the father carrying the smallest kid in the shoe, the mother counting heads with the rapid efficiency of someone who had been counting heads for years. "Thank you," she said, not looking up, grabbing the littlest one's jacket from the floor where it had somehow also ended up. "Safe flight," Declan said. And the family went down the jet bridge, and Declan closed the gate and went to his next one. He didn't think of it as anything, he was just doing his job. But that's the thing about doing the right thing, small version. It doesn't announce itself, it just happens, and keeps happening, and slowly. Without fanfare, it changes the texture of the place around it. That evening, Frank called Edward. Reeves agreed to all 3 addendums. Okay. He also asked if you'd be willing to meet, not about the deal, just to talk. About what he wants to build from here. Edward was quiet. He said, "When? Give me a week. I have somewhere to go first." Frank knew better than to ask where, but he had a feeling, and the feeling involved a garage on Livernois Avenue, and an 81-year-old man with a missing tooth and a philosophy about people that he delivered in short sentences while looking at engines, and a debt that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with showing up. In a house in a suburb 40 minutes from O'Hare, Patricia Hollis's son Garrett came home at midnight. From his night shift, he was tired. He put his keys on the hook, poured a glass of water, and found his mother sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. Not crying, not on her phone, just sitting. He turned on the light above the stove. Dim, not the overhead, sat down across from her. Didn't say anything, she didn't say anything. They sat in the quiet kitchen for a while. The refrigerator hummed, a car passed outside. And Garrett, 23 years old. Night shift, distribution center. Not a person who found words easy, reached across the table, put his hand over his mother's hand. Didn't speak. Just did that, and that was enough. For right now, that was enough. The morning after, Edward Mercer checked out of the Hilton, tipped the housekeeper, carried his own bag, got into the car he'd arranged. Not to the airport. The driver raised an eyebrow when he gave the address. "Detroit," Edward said. "Long drive." "I know," Edward said. He settled into the back seat, opened his book, the same James Baldwin he'd been reading at Gate G9 3 mornings ago. The spine cracked softly in the familiar place. He started reading. Outside the window, Chicago disappeared behind him, and the road opened up, and somewhere up ahead, about 4 hours away, an old man was sitting in front of a garage on Livernois Avenue, probably with coffee, probably with a lot of opinions about whatever was on the radio. Not knowing anyone was coming, which was fine. Edward had learned a long time ago that the best arrivals were the unannounced ones, the ones that said, "I thought of you. So I came," no agenda, no meeting on the calendar, just "I thought of you, so I came." Detroit in November looks like a city that has made peace with difficulty. Not given up, not broken, just acquainted with hard things, familiar with them, the way an old scar is familiar, still there, still visible, but no longer the whole story. Edward's car came off the highway at 11:40 in the morning. He hadn't been back in almost 8 months. He watched the neighborhoods change outside the window the way they always changed. The newer developments near the expressway giving way to the older streets. The ones that looked exactly like they'd looked in 1989. The ones that looked like they'd been through 3 lifetimes since then. The ones that were somewhere in between. He knew this city the way you know the lines on your own hand. Because it made him. Not the money, not the firm, not the handshakes and the board seats and the closed deals. This city, these streets, the understanding that nothing is given and everything costs something, and the question is always what you're willing to pay. Levallois Avenue. The garage looked exactly the same, which was either comforting or alarming, depending on your philosophy about change. The sign above the door was the same sign, Grayburn Auto, red letters, white background. The kind of sign that was made before people worried about fonts and branding. The kind that simply said what the place was. 2 cars in the lot. A dog, elderly and unconcerned, asleep in a patch of weak November sun near the door. And Marcus, Otis's son, who was wiping his hands on a shop rag when the car pulled in. He looked up with an expression that moved through surprise and landed somewhere warm. Edward, Marcus. They shook hands. The grip of 2 men who'd known each other for decades without being close. Respectful. Real, he's out back, Marcus said. I'll take you. Out back was a covered porch that someone had added maybe 20 years ago. Aluminum roof. 3 plastic chairs. A space heater that sounded like it was arguing with itself. Otis Grayburn was in the middle chair, 81 years old. He was wearing a plaid flannel shirt and a Detroit Tigers cap. A thermos of coffee sat on the small table beside him. He was reading a newspaper, an actual newspaper, folded in quarters the way people used to fold newspapers. He looked up when Marcus opened the back door, and the face that Edward had been carrying in his wallet for 30 years went from ink and paper to real and present and still missing that tooth on the left side. Well, Otis said, look what the highway dragged in. Edward sat down in the chair beside him. Marcus disappeared back inside with the practiced tact of a man who knew when to leave a room. The space heater argued with itself. The dog had apparently followed them back and was now resettling near the door with the sighing drama of the genuinely comfortable. You could have called, Otis said. I know, instead of just showing up. I know. I could have been busy. Were you? Otis looked at his newspaper. No. They sat for a moment, the kind of sitting that doesn't need filling. Edward had forgotten about this, about the particular quality of Otis's silences, how they didn't demand anything, how they just held. I know about the flight, Edward said. Otis's expression didn't change, not exactly, but something in it shifted. The newspaper lowered slightly. Marcus told you. He didn't have to. It was in a file. What kind of file? The kind that gets put together when something goes wrong and someone needs to understand how wrong. Otis looked at him for a moment, then the woman at the gate. Yes, she worked for your airline. Not anymore. Otis absorbed this. He picked up his thermos, poured a small amount of coffee into the cup lid, looked at it. Eddie, he said, I'm going to tell you something and I want you to hear it before you say whatever you came here to say. Edward waited. What happened at that airport? Otis paused. It wasn't the worst thing that's ever happened to me. Not even close. I have been alive for 81 years. I grew up when I grew up. I know what bad looks like. I know you do. So I need you to not make this bigger than it is for me, because if you make it bigger than it is, then I have to carry that too. He looked at Edward. You understand what I'm saying? Edward understood. I'm not here to make it bigger, he said. I'm here because I should have come a long time ago, before any of this happened, and I didn't, and that's on me. Silence. You've been busy, Otis said. That's not a good enough reason. No, Otis agreed, it's not, but he said it without accusation, just fact, the way Otis delivered most things. Edward reached into his jacket, pulled out the envelope. Thomas Reeves had written the letter by hand. Edward had read it before sealing it, had almost rewritten it himself, had decided that wasn't his place. He put it on the table beside the thermos. Otis looked at it, didn't pick it up immediately. From the airline, Edward said. Their CEO, handwritten. Handwritten, Otis repeated. I asked for that specifically. Otis picked it up, turned it over, set it back down. I'll read it later, he said. Okay, right now I want to know how you're doing. Edward opened his mouth, closed it. Because the question landed differently than he expected. Not how did it feel to be turned away. Not what did you do about it. Not the questions that had been circling him for the past week in all the meetings and calls and documents. Just, how are you doing? He started, sat with it, which was something he almost never did. Here is the thing about being Edward Mercer. You learn early to move, to act, to convert every problem into a sequence of decisions and execute them with speed and clarity. This is how you survive. This is how you build something from nothing. This is how you walk into a room full of people who don't expect you and walk out having changed the terms. You move and you keep moving, because stillness for a long time meant falling behind. But Otis Grayburn had never moved fast in his life. Otis moved carefully, deliberately. He took the full amount of time a thing required and not 1 second less. And right now he was sitting in a plastic chair on a covered porch in November, waiting for Edward Mercer to finish answering a question he'd started answering 30 seconds ago. Without impatience, without filling the space, just waiting. I'm tired, Edward said. Simple. True. Of what? Of being surprised when it happens. A pause. I'm 67 years old. I've been doing this since I was a young man, and I'm still. He stopped. I'm still surprised every time. Some part of me thinks maybe this time it won't happen, and then it does, and then it does. Otis nodded slowly. That part, he said, doesn't go away. I can tell you that with confidence, from 81 years of data, despite himself. Edward almost smiled. Great, he said. But here's what does change, Otis said. What you do with it. He picked up his coffee cup. When I was younger, I'd get angry. Real angry. The kind that sits in your chest for days. And now I get sad. Which I know doesn't sound better. But it is. He looked out toward the garage. Anger makes you small. Sad makes you see more. Makes you want things to be different in a bigger way. Edward thought about that. I built something, he said. Out of what happened. Or I'm trying to. The airline is changing their process. The people who were hurt are getting real acknowledgement. There's a young man who spoke up when he didn't have to. He's being recognized for that. Good. But it doesn't feel. He struggled for the word. Finished. It's not, Otis said simply. It never is. That's not how it works. He finally picked up the envelope, tucked it into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt, patted it once. You drove 4 hours to bring me this, he said. Yes, you could have mailed it. I could have. Otis looked at him. Thank you, he said, for the letter and for the 4 hours. And somehow the second thing mattered more than the first. Edward knew that. He suspected Otis did too. They sat for another hour, talked about nothing that would make headlines. The tigers, Marcus's youngest learning to read. What was changing in the neighborhood and what stubbornly refused to. The dog moved from the door to underneath Otis' chair and went back to sleep with a dignity that suggested it had always been there. When Edward finally stood to go, Otis stayed seated, because standing took effort now and Otis was practical about effort. But he held out his hand, and when Edward took it, Otis covered it with both of his. You turned out all right, Eddie, he said. I knew you would. You knew more than I did, Edward said. Most people do when you're young. The missing tooth showed in the grin. That's what young people are for. Proving the older ones right eventually. Edward laughed, real, unguarded. The kind that doesn't come from being charming or professional, just from being somewhere that felt like home. He was back in Chicago by 7 that evening. Patricia Hollis had been unemployed for 3 weeks before she understood what the word really meant. Not the dictionary definition. She'd known that all along, the felt definition. The way Tuesday morning becomes indistinguishable from Thursday morning. The way the uniform on the hook becomes an accusation you can't answer. The way you start calculating not what you want to buy but what you can afford to stop buying. The mortgage was the number she kept coming back to. Numbers had always been Patricia's language. Managing a gate was a logistics problem. Variables and timing and flow. She was good at it. She ran the numbers on her savings, on her severance, on the timeline. The numbers were clear. Not good, but clear. 3 lawyers declined her case in the first week. Not rudely, carefully. The kind of careful that means the same thing as no but takes longer to say it. Given the circumstances, given the documented record, given the involvement of, they didn't always finish that sentence. She understood what they were not finishing. Carol stopped returning her texts after the second week, which wasn't surprising, which still landed harder than she expected. She had thought they were friends. She was revising that assessment now. In the particular way you revise things when you discover that certain friendships were attached to your position rather than to you. She sent applications to 3 other carriers. No responses. She understood this too. She went back to the numbers. She sold the second car, the SUV Ray polished every weekend. It went to a young couple who looked at it with the particular excitement of people buying their first decent vehicle. Patricia handed over the keys and felt nothing, which was its own kind of answer about how far she had traveled from who she used to be. The job at Freshmart came through a temp agency, not the Freshmart near her house, a different one, 22 minutes away by bus. She had not taken a bus to work since she was in her mid-20s. She stood at the stop the first morning in her regular clothes and felt exposed, like something that had been between her and the world had been removed without warning, and she was standing there without it, in the cold, waiting for something that ran on its own schedule and did not care about hers. She got on the bus. She sat near the window. She watched the city go by. The Freshmart uniform was a blue polo shirt and a black apron. The name badge was bright yellow, Patricia, in cheerful block letters that had nothing to do with how she felt. She clipped it to her apron on the first morning and stood at her register and understood, in 30 seconds, something she had not understood in 11 years of working the other side of the transaction. This was a different country. The language was different. The power was different. The particular combination of invisibility and exposure was different in ways she did not have words for yet, but was learning. She was expected to smile, not the controlled professional smile she had spent 11 years perfecting. A different kind, immediate, open, the kind that costs something when you don't mean it. She practiced it in the car mirror on the second morning. She looked, she thought, genuinely unwell. She kept practicing. The first month was survival. The second month was something harder, because survival has a momentum to it, an urgency that keeps you moving. But the second month she started actually being still, and still was where the thoughts lived. She started keeping a notepad. Didn't know why at first. Maybe because the days ran together if she didn't mark them somehow. Maybe because she needed to hear herself, the real version, not the version she presented to the world, even if only in a notebook that no one else would ever read. Wrote small things at first. The number of people who said thank you at her register, more than she'd expected. The number of people who didn't make eye contact, also more than expected, but expected. She wrote about a young mother who came through in the third week. 3 kids, a stack of coupons, a card that didn't go through the first time, a line building behind her. The face of someone trying very hard not to fall apart in public in front of strangers and her own children. Patricia had felt the familiar flicker, the impatience, the calculation of time and flow and the people waiting behind. She caught it, stopped it, said instead, "Take your time. It's okay." The young mother had looked up at her like she'd said something extraordinary, which meant, Patricia understood, that being told it's okay was not something that woman encountered often enough. Which said something about the world, about the gap between how easy it was to offer a small kindness and how rarely people chose to cross it. She wrote that down, and then beneath it she wrote, "When did I stop doing that?" And then, because it was late and she was alone at the kitchen table and there was no one to perform anything, for I know exactly when. She did not write more that night, but she came back to it the next night, and the one after that. There was a particular customer who came in on Friday afternoons, an older man, maybe 75. Always the same small number of items, paid with exact change, counted it out carefully. The first Friday she had felt the old reflex, the line, the time she had not acted on it. She had waited and taken the coins and said, "Have a good evening." He had looked up and said, "You too, young lady," which made her feel unexpectedly and privately, almost okay, young lady. She was 49, but he'd meant it with warmth, and she had not, in a very long time, been the recipient of something a stranger meant with warmth. She thought about what that meant. She wrote that down too. Garrett was another thing she wrote about. Her son, 23, night shift at the distribution center. He had not, since the night she came home and found him sitting in the dark kitchen, said a single word about what happened. Not to her? She assumed not to his father either, though with Garrett you could never entirely tell. He had started coming home from his overnight shift at 7 in the morning and making coffee and sitting at the kitchen table while she got ready for her bus. Not talking, just there. She had asked him once, "Don't you need to sleep?" He'd shrugged, "I'll sleep later." She didn't push it, but she thought about it constantly, on the bus, at her register. In the notebook, this boy who had spent his whole life watching her be hard and controlled and certain had decided without being asked to sit with her in the mornings. Without saying "I told you," without saying "You deserve this," without saying anything at all, just sitting. She wrote about that too. And then she wrote the things she'd been avoiding for weeks. She wrote about 2009, the check-in hall, the man in the suit, the volume, the supervisor standing 12 feet away doing nothing. The way the afternoon felt after, driving home in silence, understanding that no one was going to say it was wrong. She had kept that memory in the room in the back of her mind where she put things she didn't want to deal with. She'd kept it there for 16 years, closed the door, told herself it had made her stronger, told herself that's just how things worked and you either got hard or you got used. Writing it down was different. Writing made it real in a different way, made her look at it directly instead of around it. She sat at the kitchen table at midnight and looked at what she'd written, and for the first time since any of this started she cried. Not for herself exactly, or not only for herself. For the person she'd been at 33 who had deserved better and hadn't gotten it, and for all the people who'd stood at her gate over the years and deserved better and hadn't gotten it from her. She had become the thing that hurt her. She hadn't planned to. That wasn't an excuse, but it was true. And true things have to be looked at before anything useful can happen with them. 6 weeks after her last day at Meridian Air, Declan Burrows walked into Freshmart. Patricia saw him come through the door before he saw her, and what happened in her chest was complicated. She recognized him immediately. She knew the way he moved, the set of his shoulders. He was in regular clothes, jeans and a jacket, and he looked different out of uniform, younger, more like just a person. He was heading for the wine section. She thought about pretending not to see him. She thought about needing to be somewhere else. The back of the store, the break room. Anywhere that wasn't here, except he looked up, saw her. And she watched him make the same calculation in about half a second. Neither of them looked away. He brought his items to her register. A bottle of wine, some crackers, a wedge of cheese. She scanned them without speaking. He stood on the other side without speaking. The machine beeped between them. Then he said quietly, "How are you doing? Not how are you doing? The difference is small, it's everything." "I'm managing," she said. She handed him the receipt. He took it. "Didn't leave. I want you to know," he said. "I submitted that statement before I knew who he was. That's the truth." She looked at him. "I know. I read the investigation summary." He nodded. "I should have said something at the gate. I didn't. You were new, you were scared, yeah." A pause. That's still not a good enough reason. She recognized the shape of that sentence, the refusal to let itself off the hook. She'd been thinking similar things about a longer list of her own decisions. "No," she said, "it's not." Silence. The store moved around them. Someone's cart squeaked past. The refrigerator units hummed along the back wall. "He asked about you," Declan said, "Mr. Mercer. During the follow-up calls after the investigation closed. He asked if anyone knew why you were the way you were." He looked at her steadily. Not to find more evidence, he just asked. Like he actually wanted to understand. Patricia was quiet. "I didn't have an answer," Declan said. "I didn't know you well enough." She looked down at the register, then up. "I had a reason," she said. "It wasn't a good one, but I had one. You don't have to tell me, no. A beat." "I know." But she told him anyway. Not everything. Not the Midnight Notebook version with all its rough edges, but enough the check-in hall. The supervisor who watched and said nothing useful afterward. The lesson she'd absorbed going in the wrong direction. Declan listened without performing his listening. When she finished, he said, "That makes sense. What happened to you? It doesn't make sense what you did with it over the years, but it makes sense that it happened." She nodded. "There's something else," he said. "The young woman, the cello. I thought you should know she's playing again." Patricia went still. "Is she okay?" "She got into a fellowship program. Piano, not cello, because of the damage to the instrument. But she's playing. She's good." Something moved in Patricia's chest. Very small, very careful. Not forgiveness of herself. Not yet. That was going to take real time and real work. But maybe the beginning of understanding that the damage she had done was not entirely permanent. That some things could repair even after being broken. "If you ever have a way to say it," Patricia said, "tell her I'm sorry, I will." He gathered his bag. "I got into the leadership program," he said. "The one they started January." "Good," she said, meant it. Entirely, cleanly meant it. He nodded, walked toward the door, paused once without turning all the way around. "Patricia," his voice dropped. "What happened to you back then? Someone should have helped you." "I'm sorry they didn't." The automatic doors opened for him. He walked through. The doors slid closed. The store carried on around her. The lights, the beep of her register, the particular hum of a place that does not stop for anyone's private moments. She stood there, just stood, and let that sentence do what it needed to do. 2 weeks after that, a letter arrived. Cream envelope, handwritten address. She almost didn't open it. She made coffee first, sat down at the kitchen table where she'd been doing all her real thinking lately, opened it. Thomas Reeves had small, neat handwriting. The kind that suggested someone who had been taught to take the act of writing seriously. He wrote about the investigation, about what the footage showed, about the review board and what it was finding as it worked through the broader complaint history. Then he wrote, "I am not writing to explain what happened or to ask your forgiveness. I am writing because you deserve to hear this directly. Meridian Air failed you. Not in this investigation, years before it. We built a culture where your behavior was possible, where it was, in certain ways, rewarded. That is a failure of leadership and I own it completely." She stopped. "Read that paragraph again and again. We failed you. Not you are solely responsible. Not you are a bad person. Not the comfortable version where it was all her fault and the system had been fine all along and nothing else had contributed. We failed you." She didn't agree entirely. She knew her own choices. She had made them repeatedly across years against whatever was left of her better instincts. She owned that. She was in the process of learning to own it without being crushed by it. But she had also been a 33-year-old woman standing in a check-in hall being screamed at while her supervisor watched. And no one had called that a failure. No one had written her a letter about that. No one had said, "You deserved better than what we gave you that day." She finished the letter. Reeves wrote about the changes being implemented, the review board, the new complaint process, the leadership program, Declan's role in it. The last paragraph, I don't know what comes next for you. I hope it's something good. I mean that genuinely, not as a formality. What you did was wrong. But wrong things are done by people who are also often worth more than their worst moments. I am trying to hold on to that as we rebuild. I hope you find something to hold on to as well. She folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, thought about Otis Grayburn, whose name she now knew from the investigation summary. The man who had opened his bag in front of strangers at the gate. The man who had taken a 9-hour bus ride rather than come back to an airport, where he'd been made to feel like he'd done something wrong when he hadn't done anything at all. She thought about him for a long time. Then she took out her notepad, wrote the date at the top of a fresh page, and began. Not a letter she would send, maybe never, but she began. I don't know if this ever reaches you. I don't know if it should. But I need to say it somewhere, even if it only goes as far as this page. What I did to you at the gate, I had no reason. You were just a person going somewhere. And I made you feel like you'd done something wrong when you hadn't done anything at all. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not asking for it. I just need you to exist somewhere in my accounting of things as a real person, whose morning I ruined for no good reason. You deserved better. I'm sorry I didn't give it to you. She set down the pen, sat in the quiet kitchen. Ray was asleep down the hall. Garrett would be back from his shift in a few hours. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed slowly on the wet street. She didn't feel better exactly. Clean isn't the same as better. But she felt like something had been put down that she'd been carrying wrong for a very long time. That was enough for tonight. April came to Chicago the way April always does. Tentatively. With the specific optimism of a city that has been cold for too long and isn't quite sure it's allowed to relax yet. Edward Mercer was at O'Hare. He had a flight to Boston. Business, not ceremony. A follow-up meeting on the Halverson deal. Nothing dramatic. He was wearing the blue hoodie his daughter had given him. The same one. He'd thought briefly about wearing something else. A jacket. Something that announced itself a little more. He put the hoodie on anyway, because he was 67 years old, and he had spent enough of his life making adjustments for people who shouldn't have required them. He walked through Terminal 3 with his carry-on and his paperback and his boarding pass on his phone. Gate G9. Different gate agent at the podium. Young woman, late 20s, focused and organized. She looked up when he approached, and smiled. Real easy. The kind that doesn't cost extra. Mr. Mercer, good morning. You're in 1A, we're boarding in about 10 minutes. Can I get you anything while you wait? I'm fine, thank you. Safe flight. He stepped aside to wait, looked around the gate area, same chairs, same carpet, same view of the tarmac through the wide windows. But the energy was different. Quieter in the way that settled feels different from suppressed. A family with young children was at the desk asking about stroller policy. The gate agent was helping them patiently. Checking the screen, explaining clearly. An older man in a wheelchair was being assisted by a ground crew member who had crouched down to his eye level to talk to him, rather than talking over his head. Small things, easy to miss if you weren't looking. The kind of things that don't make news because they are simply people doing their jobs with care. Which is all it had ever needed to be, which Edward now understood was harder to sustain than it looked. It required systems that supported it, leadership that named it as the standard. People who were told, explicitly and repeatedly, that how they treated the person in front of them was the actual job. Not the fastest boarding time. Not the cleanest incident reports. The actual job. Boarding was called. Edward moved toward the jet bridge with the other first-class passengers. The gate agent scanned his pass and said, "Have a great flight," and meant it in the way you can sometimes tell people mean things. He walked down the jet bridge, settled into seat 1A, looked out the window at the tarmac below. The ground crew was finishing up, the fuel trucks pulling back, the organized machinery of departure doing what it always did. The flight attendant, a woman he recognized from an earlier trip, came through the cabin. 22 years with the airline. The kind of institutional memory that carries a place's real history in ways that no annual report ever captures. She stopped at his row. Mr. Mercer, her voice was low, meant only for him. I don't know all the details of what happened last year. Nobody tells us the whole story, but something changed in how the company talks to us. In what we're told matters. She paused. I've been doing this for 22 years. There are days you forget why you started. Is today one of those days? He asked. No, she said. Today is not one of those days. She moved on down the aisle. Edward turned back to the window. The engines were building to that specific pitch, the one that means we are done with the ground now. He thought about Otis on the covered porch, the thermos of coffee, the dog sighing in the corner. The way Otis had asked, "How are you doing?" and then simply waited for the actual answer without filling the space. He thought about Declan Burrows, 26 years old, who had chosen to write an email on a Tuesday morning because his wife asked him one question he couldn't honestly answer the wrong way. He thought about Garrett, Patricia's son, sitting at the kitchen table in the early morning saying nothing, just sitting, which is its own kind of language if you know how to read it. He thought about Eunice Caldwell, whom he had never met and likely never would. 71 years old, retired school teacher, who had stood in the regular boarding line and watched, and then done the thing she had been doing her whole life without fanfare, which was bear witness to what was real. Her letter to the Tribune had reached him 3 months after she sent it, forwarded by Frank with a note that said, "Simply thought you should see this." Her last line, "I hope he knows that somebody saw." He did now. The plane began to move. Slow at first, the terminal sliding past the window, then faster, the runway opening up ahead. Edward opened his book. The familiar crack of the spine, the pages finding the place he'd left off. He read 3 sentences, then he stopped, and put the book down, and did something he almost never did at the start of a flight, which was nothing. Just sat. Just let the speed build and the ground fall away, and the clouds come up to meet the window and then part, and then there was the sky above them. The particular blue of high altitude, clean and flat and going in every direction at once. Here is what karma actually is. It is not a lightning bolt. It is not fire from the sky. It is not the universe keeping score in some dramatic ledger where the balance eventually corrects itself in a single satisfying moment. It is Eunice Caldwell taking out a small notebook in a boarding line, because she has spent 71 years believing that the truth is worth writing down even when no one asks for it. It is Declan Burrows lying awake at midnight, thinking about a question his wife asked him that he could not honestly answer the wrong way. It is Garrett coming home from a night shift and making coffee and sitting at a kitchen table with a mother he loves even at her worst, without saying a word about it, without requiring anything back. It is Thomas Reeves picking up a pen instead of calling his communications team and writing by hand to an 81-year-old man who took a 9-hour bus ride because the world had been unkind to him in an airport. It is Otis Grayburn asking, "How are you doing?" and waiting for the real answer with the patience of someone who has understood for a long time that most people are worth more than they're currently being paid for. It is Patricia Hollis at her kitchen table at midnight, finally putting down on paper the thing she had been running from for 16 years. Not because anyone asked her to, not because it would fix everything, because some truths have to be written before you can carry them without being crushed. It is Edward Mercer driving 4 hours to Detroit with an envelope and no agenda. Just, "I thought of you, so I came." That is what karma is, small, human, accumulating. The weight of 1,000 small choices made by people who were tired and scared and imperfect, and who chose in the specific moment that mattered to do the thing they knew was right. Not because it was easy, not because anyone guaranteed them it would work out, just because it was right and they knew it and they could not find a way to live with themselves if they chose otherwise. The plane leveled out above the clouds. Edward picked his book back up. Read, really read this time. The words going in the way words go in when your mind is finally quiet enough to receive them. Outside the window, nothing but sky. All the way to the horizon, in every direction, just sky. And he was in it, in seat 1A, which had always been exactly where he belonged. Some months later, these things were true. Patricia Hollis found work in logistics dispatch. Same skills, different industry. A supervisor who knew nothing of her history and hired her on what he could actually see. She was not the warmest person in that office, but she was no longer the coldest. She still kept the notepad. She never sent the letter to Otis Grayburn, but she wrote it 4 more times, each version shorter, each version more honest. She thought that someday the right version might find its way out into the world. She was in no hurry. Some things take the time they take. Declan Burrows completed the leadership program in April. He was, by all accounts, the most thoughtful person in his cohort, not the loudest, not the most visibly ambitious, the most thoughtful, which turned out, in the new Meridian Air, to be precisely what they were looking for. Otis Grayburn read Thomas Reeves's letter twice, then placed it on the small table beside his chair, where he kept the things that mattered. A photograph of his wife, a hockey program from a game in 1974 that he still described with more pride than the injury had warranted. Now this, he didn't talk about it much. But Marcus noticed that when the subject of flying came up, his father no longer changed the subject. Eunice Caldwell flew to Boston without incident, visited her granddaughter for a long weekend, ate too much seafood, came home with a small watercolor her granddaughter had painted of the harbor. She hung it in her bedroom. She never learned that her letter to the Tribune had been forwarded to Edward Mercer. She never knew what it meant to him. Some things you do simply because they're right. Not because you'll know the outcome. Not because anyone will confirm it mattered. Eunice Caldwell had understood that for a very long time. Probably since a Tuesday afternoon 30 years ago, when she stayed after class to ask a student who'd been quietly crying in the back row for 3 weeks if everything was okay. It had been, eventually. That student was fine now. Eunice had never stopped believing that small acts of attention were the most important acts available to ordinary people. She had never found any evidence that she was wrong. Edward Mercer landed in Boston at 10:47 in the morning. He had a meeting at noon. He took a cab. He looked out the window at a city he'd been to hundreds of times, and noticed it the way you notice things when you're not already somewhere else in your head. The meeting went well. He flew home that evening. Different seat this time. 2A, the window on the other side. Same sky though, above the clouds, always the same sky.